Sega thought it had found the perfect way to ambush Sony. Launch the Saturn early, grab the next generation first, and make the PlayStation look late before it even arrived. Then came the Electronic Entertainment Expo in 1995. In one press conference, Sega announced the Saturn was already in stores. The move was meant to shock the industry. Instead, it blindsided retailers, angered developers, confused customers, and started a countdown Sega could not stop. To understand why Sega risked everything on that surprise launch, you have to go back to the moment when Sega looked unstoppable. In the early 1990s, the Genesis, known as the Mega Drive outside North America, turned Sega into Nintendo's first real threat. Nintendo was still the family-friendly giant, but Sega sold itself as faster, louder, and more dangerous. Sonic the Hedgehog was not just a mascot, he was a mission statement. That attitude worked. Sega attacked Nintendo in commercials, pushed sports games and arcade action, and made the Genesis feel like the console for players who had outgrown the old rules. For a few years, Sega was not chasing the industry. Sega was helping define it. Then the ground started moving. Three-dimensional graphics were becoming the future. Arcade hardware was getting more advanced, and the next console generation was coming fast. Sony, a company with money, technology, and something to prove, was preparing to enter the market with the PlayStation. Inside Sega, the message became harder to read. The Sega CD promised a new multimedia future, but never became essential. The 32X arrived as another upgrade, asking Genesis owners to buy an add-on while a true next-generation console was already on the way. Instead of building confidence, Sega was splitting attention across too many directions. By 1995, Sega needed more than another product. It needed one decisive move that made the company look powerful again. That is why the Saturn launch mattered so much. The Saturn was meant to be Sega's clean answer to the next generation. It was a 32-bit console built around the kind of fast arcade experiences Sega was known for. With games like Virtua Fighter showing that polygon graphics were no longer just a tech demo, Sega wanted players to see the Saturn and think of the arcade coming home. The original United States launch was supposed to happen on September 2, 1995. Sega even gave it a name, Saturn Day. That date gave stores time to prepare displays, gave magazines time to build coverage, and gave developers a clear target for launch games. On paper, it looked organized, but Sony changed the pressure inside the room. The PlayStation was coming, and Sega feared that if it waited until September, Sony would own the conversation before Saturn had a chance to build momentum. Sega had already watched hype become a weapon in the console business. If Sony looked like the future first, Sega might start the generation from behind, so the early launch began to look tempting. It could put Saturn on shelves before PlayStation, make Sega appear aggressive, and turn uncertainty into a headline. From inside Sega, speed looked like control. The problem was that a console launch is not just a date, it is a coordinated event involving retailers, publishers, manufacturing, marketing, and trust. Sega chose speed and surprise, believing the industry would catch up after the announcement. In May 1995, the first Electronic Entertainment Expo gave the game industry a new public stage. Los Angeles was filled with publishers, retailers, press, and hardware companies trying to define what the next generation would look like. Sega and Sony were no longer just preparing consoles, they were preparing arguments. Sega went first. During its presentation, Sega of America President Tom Kalinske walked on stage and delivered the announcement that was meant to seize the show. The Saturn would not launch in September after all. It was already available in the United States. For the audience, it sounded like a power move. Sega had skipped the waiting period and put a 32-bit console on sale months before Sony's PlayStation. The price was $399, and the message was simple: the next generation had started, and Sega was first. The reality was much narrower than the headline. Saturn units had only been shipped to selected retailers, including major chains Sega had chosen in advance. Many stores had no systems at all. The early software lineup was also small, built around a handful of titles, with Virtua Fighter as the obvious showpiece. Kalinske's reveal created exactly the kind of shock Sega wanted in the room. It gave journalists a dramatic lead, gave Sega a claim to being first, and forced everyone at the show to react. But the surprise had a cost before a single console was sold. Behind the scenes, many of Sega's own retail and publishing partners were hearing the news at the same time as the public. The first backlash came from the people Sega needed most: retailers. Chains that had not been included in the early rollout were suddenly watching competitors sell a major new console months ahead of schedule. Some had built plans around the original September launch window. Now they looked unprepared, even though Sega had kept them them out of the loop. That damage was not just temporary embarrassment. Retail relationships were the machinery that got consoles onto shelves, into advertisements, and in front of parents during the holiday season. Reports from the time described major retailers, including KB Toys, refusing to support the Saturn after being excluded. For a console that needed every possible display case and sales pitch, Sega had turned partners into skeptics before the race had really started. Developers had the same problem from a different angle. Many third-party studios were still building their Saturn games for the planned launch later in the year. Sega's surprise announcement did not magically finish those projects. It only exposed how little was ready. That left the Saturn with a thin early library. Virtua Fighter gave Sega an arcade name to promote, but one recognizable title could not carry a $400 machine by itself. Worse, third-party publishers now had proof that Sega might make major decisions without giving them time to respond. Support for a console depends on confidence, and the Saturn's first impression made confidence harder to justify. Then came the consumer reaction. The Saturn was expensive at $399, difficult to find in many areas, and surrounded by confusion over where it was actually available. A surprise launch can feel exciting when the product is everywhere and the games are undeniable. Sega had delivered the surprise without the support structure. For players, the message was unclear. The Saturn was here, but not fully here. It was powerful but costly. It had arrived first, but without the kind of software lineup that made being first feel important. Sega had tried to win the next generation with speed. Instead, it weakened its retail network, strained its developer support, and made early buyers hesitate. Then Sony walked onto the same Electronic Entertainment Expo stage with a simpler message, a lower price, and an audience ready to listen. Sony did not need a long presentation to answer Sega. At the same Electronic Entertainment Expo, Sony executive Steve Race walked to the podium for what became one of the most famous moments in gaming history. He did not explain the hardware. He did not list every feature. He reportedly said one thing, $299. Then he walked off. That was the entire message Sony needed. In 1 second, the PlayStation looked $100 cheaper than the Saturn, and the difference was easy for anyone to understand. Parents did not need a spec sheet. Retailers did not need a complicated sales pitch. Players did not need to decode launch windows or surprise availability. Sony had turned price into a punchline, and Sega was the target. The timing made it brutal. Sega had just spent its moment telling the industry that Saturn was expensive, rushed, and already on limited shelves. Sony answered with a console that sounded cleaner, calmer, and more consumer-friendly. The PlayStation was not being forced into stores early. It was being introduced with confidence. That contrast became the story of the show. Sega's message required explanation. Sony's message fit into a single number. From that point on, Saturn was no longer leading the next generation. It was defending a mistake. The damage did not end at launch. It followed Saturn through the rest of its life in the West. Retailers who had been left out of Sega's surprise release had little reason to help the system recover. Some stores reduced support. Others gave better placement and attention to the PlayStation, which arrived with a clearer plan and fewer burned bridges. For a console business, that mattered. Hardware does not just sell because it exists. It needs shelf space, staff recommendations, advertising support, and confidence from the people placing orders. Publishers were making the same calculation. Saturn was difficult to develop for, with a complex dual-processor design that made three-dimensional games harder to build. Sony offered cheaper hardware, easier tools, and a growing audience that looked more reliable every month. Developers followed the platform that seemed less risky, and players followed the games. Sega still had strong titles. Virtua Fighter, Sega Rally Championship, and Nights into Dreams proved the Saturn could deliver excellent experiences. But in the West, those wins could not undo the larger problem. The system felt expensive, confused, and unsupported compared with the PlayStation's steady rise. That is why Saturn's failure was never just about power. Sega lost because it broke trust at the exact moment trust mattered most. Retailers did not forget. Publishers hesitated. Consumers waited. By the time Sega tried to reset the story, the market had already chosen its safer future, and Sega's next console, the Dreamcast, would have to launch under the shadow of everything Saturn had damaged. The Saturn did not just lose a generation. It made the Dreamcast fight for forgiveness before it could fight for sales. Sega's final console had brilliant ideas, but the company had already spent too much trust, money, and time. Sega tried to win with surprise. The lesson was brutal. Partners matter. Thanks for watching. Tell me in the comments if Sega could have survived with a normal Saturn launch.